Mother's cathedral emptied out by officers. She returned with a bowed head and a hand vacant of her heirloom. Mother, you will soon orphan me. How can you have given me something the marauders would want? Eldest, you still have your body. Nobody said this, of course. The body is an embarrassment. What good is a thing so badly made that it breaks in the time it takes to grow a daughter up to nothing? Mother, how many lovers I will have. I am not embarrassed, but I will not tell you because my body is a language you never learned. But your body was my first language.
Thank you for reading that. I think this is a tender, tense, and heartfelt love poem for your mother, or maybe for a mother. It opens with pain and anxiety, some religiously wrapped guilt, maybe some regret. And there is a tension of the child knowing the mother in a way that the mother maybe can never know the child, although I'm sure that goes both ways.
I think it's interesting that that's something that people think of when they think of, I mean, clearly there are some like references to religious buildings or maybe even, I don't know, things that people, but I don't ever think of guilt or like, to me, that's not two things that go together. It's like religion of any kind and guilt of any kind.
Oh, interesting.
I think that happens to people, and that's happened over the course of like the development of structures of religions and how it's translated by different communities and the state that might co-sign that religion. But I don't think that's ever been. I don't write about religious guilt ever because I don't have
That's
any.
refreshing.
Yeah, I heard like, I'm gonna just say his name. I heard like Dinty Moore read something about like, you know, I think it was supposed to be subversive against Roman Catholicism, but it didn't do anything new for me when it came to writing about just some of these lexicons of religion and also how it's embodied by different communities. And as far as my upbringing, it was this, whatever people consider a traditional structure of Roman Catholicism was really diffused by a lot of like the local belief systems. And and in the case of like, for example, my dad's village, they didn't even have a church. There was no church to go to, nowhere for anyone to talk to, like teach anyone else. You did stuff at home. Somehow you were acculturated that this was the universe and this was your place in it. And so it was never like this all-seeming authority in our lives ever.
They consider themselves Catholic?
Yeah. That's what people are. There's in their mind, that's just that people are some version of that.
Yeah.
I had a friend in high school who had been born in Armenia when it was the Soviet Union. And she and her family, like, I think they baptized her in the Orthodox Church, but, you know, she believes in science. And my parents are like, they don't subscribe to a lot of like dogmatic, you know, by the book stuff, but they're like, so she doesn't like have any church, like not even a church to rebel at, like not even somebody to shake your fist at. At least if church is good for anything, it's at least so you can shake your fist at it.
Yeah.
And they're like, so she doesn't even have that? And I'm like, no, like, so she's just like a little orphan in the universe. And I'm like, she's not an orphan. So like, I can see how that for people, it's like this little house we live in.
Yeah.
You can break things inside of it because it's your house. Yeah. But at least the little house.
Yeah. And then, like you said, there's some people, it's like, oh, they don't even have that little house to break things, like your mom was saying about your friend. It's refreshing to hear someone say that they don't associate guilt with religion, because I feel like that's such a huge thing for people, like from a lot of different religious practices. So it's nice to hear someone who doesn't subscribe to that.
I have guilt about like social privileges, like for example, being born in this country and not having to struggle to get even legal residence because my parents were undocumented. They didn't have visas, they didn't have passports or there was nothing to give them any kind of protection while they were here when I was growing up. So I do have survivor's remorse of that,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and there was a constant threat of separation when I was growing up, but that didn't happen. I have guilt about that, like, especially with so many children separated from their parents now, right? So it just feels like I was just handed a world. Like all I had to do was be born. And that I struggle with.
Yeah, you got lucky. Yeah.
I did.
Yeah. I feel that way a lot too.
Yeah. I mean, there are a lot of structures in place to ensure that, you know, some of us get lucky in some ways. And even like the amnesty that allowed my parents to achieve legal residence, not, you know, I don't think people understand how pathways to residency or citizenship work by the decade or by the group in question. So, you know, they don't know any of that, but they like to make blanket statements. But I know that, like, for example, that my parents were here long enough undetected before there was an amnesty, that they weren't fleeing armed conflict, that they were from living in northern states. So even when they do get deported, like, they don't take you back, they don't drop you off in front of your house. So like, imagine you're from California and they like dump you in Texas and they're like, laters, like.
Clearly they're not thinking about how their actions are affecting and upending people's lives, but then it's like kind of almost just a step further in terms of that inconsideration. Like,
well, I have read, like, especially with current policies, that the cruelty is the point.
Yeah. Sometimes I forget that, and you have to remember that.
Yeah. It's perfectly designed. I don't give anyone the benefit of anything. It's perfectly designed to cause horror.
Yeah.
And it works.
I'm not sure I can add much more to that. Thank you for putting it so eloquently. May I ask you another question about the poem? I was wondering about the last line of that, but your body was my first language. I don't know if you're familiar with the Macedonian poet Nikola Magirov, but he has a line from one of his poems, The Hands of the Clock, that has a line, "Silence is learned in the womb." And I felt an echo between those. I guess, I'm not sure if you've read him or not, but
no, but that does make sense. I think a lot of poets that I read and hold space with, that's something that we write with, that sort of haunting, right? Which is learned either, my illustrious colleague, Chiwan Choi, was talking about or writing about murder ballads, right? And Dolly Parton was talking about murder ballads, and people talk about how their families pass on verbally these stories of harrowing and these stories of survival as an instruction manual. But then there are all these things that don't get told to us, but they're still passed down. Your parents' silence about that war or that trauma or that death, they don't sit you down and tell you it with their words, but you are shown it. It's in the patterns of behavior. It's in what they don't say. It's cellular even. It's in epigenetics. There's intergenerational trauma. And so that makes perfect sense.
Do you find it difficult to write a poem that feels so personal? Or do you find it enriching? Or do you find it cathartic? Because this is a poem to me that feels really personal.
It's hard to tell. I don't subscribe to the idea of catharsis in a Freudian way. I did study psychology in undergrad, and if anything, there's a bit more of social learning theory in my observations, that a work or a labor or a task or an activity that puts things inside of you, outside of you, doesn't mean you're free, right? I think that's one thing that seems nice to say about art and making art, that it sets you free because you took what was inside and you put it outside of yourself. But I think that sometimes it just happened to you.
Mm-hmm.
Writing this poem
Yeah.
happened to me, and it was necessary. And that's all I can say about it. It's not, I didn't have, shouldn't I, what does it feel like to write this poem? I just was like, the poem demanded itself into being, I think. Memory, language, conflating the two tongues. How foreign, spoken language. I pointed at a bird of prey and said, Igola. My father said only yes and led me away. The word for damn, espressa. The word for prisoner, espressa. The word for prey, espressa. The word for cursing is damn. The word for knowing is damn. We won't even talk about garras. We won't even talk.
Thank you. I think that poem is beautiful. And one reason why I really like it is because I often find myself getting caught up in the meaning of words in different languages, like Spanish and French. I was just going to ask if you could tell me about Egola finding its way, or Egola finding its way into the poem, and was that a real moment that helped bring this poem into being? I know, like, from learning Spanish, águila, I think, right, is the word for eagle in, like, the textbook.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know, is Egola kind of more of a Spanglish evolution of that?
That's exactly what it is. So I was learning, my first language was a kind of Spanish. You find out later in life that what you thought was a language is really like a bunch of other languages. Yeah, so it turns out that the Spanish that my parents gave me is like mostly 17th century Arabic and Nahuatl, and that's sort of like how it reached them. And so, yeah, and I've heard this from like other Chicanx poets that travel to like Spain, where they'll say things and they're like, oh my gosh, that word has not been used since the 1600s. And I'm like, well, what do you want? We didn't ask for it either. And then also being in the position of being told like, that's not real language. It's not pure, as if language doesn't evolve, and as if, it's not its own kind of violence. But I think it's a shame that children are robbed of multilingualism in a country that privileges one language as superior, or as more necessary than other languages, because then what children lose is his ability to play between sounds, finding cognates or sound alikes or homonyms. And that's what I was doing a lot. I was putting words together, like one word would sound like the beginning of one word would sound like the end of the other word, and I would squish them together, right? So I learned the word for eagle in English, and I knew the word for águila in Spanish, and I was like, eagle, águila, eagle. I just like smushed them together. And Dr. Seuss made up words and everybody loved him, Lewis Carroll, the Jabberwocky. There's precedent for this, but I think it's time to just let people make up words again. Because that's how language got invented. It's just a bunch of made up stuff that somehow we agree that it has meaning or doesn't.
That's part of the fun of language too, being able to experiment and play around.
Yeah, I have a lot to say about how languages are formed and when they're anointed to be real language, or who is the police of language and where is the museum of language and who are the gatekeepers. But this was a real moment. My favorite thing to do would be to like walk around our neighborhood with my dad when I was like 4. And I remember I was trying out this language of mine. And he was like, yeah, sure, kid.
I like that. I like that he was open about it.
Yeah. My mom was more about correcting my language, because I think this is something that happens sometimes when you're afraid that this person that you love is going to go out into the world and they're going to be their value is not going to be apparent to other people because of the way they speak.
Mm-hmm.
And so her concern was that speaking incorrectly was not going to be one of those reasons. So she was more about correcting me and how to say, and with her, it was more correcting my Spanish,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like, we're not going to speak any of that half language around here.
And that's a valid concern. I mean, because that's very pragmatic of her.
It is, I think, and she thought she was doing the right thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, I still ask for her input, but when I don't, like when she tries to correct my dad, who's from a different region, and I'm like, you know what, those people can go, and then this is a way we say going to hell, we say, they can go down a tube. So if anyone's, you know, like people, my mom's like, people are gonna think he doesn't know how to speak right. I'm like, well, they can go down a tube. Yeah, and this, it took me years of actually being an English teacher
Mm-hmm.
to be like, you know what, who cares?
Yeah.
Especially
like
as an adult, I saw a lot of adults like policing children.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, this is just more like classism, racism, and nonsense that this kid does not need.
Yeah.
But death, words gather in grief. This page too, your hand touching it, your tongue holding my name. You are gathered by me. You're spoken into being by me. Call me guardian.
I thought this was a small but powerful poem, and it really got me thinking about who is the speaker of this poem, who is the addressee. Is death the speaker? Is death the addressee? Is death simply the subject? Have you thought about it in that way?
I think with a poem like this, what I think about is, you know, how people say, how can we write at a time like this? Or if people see art as not natural,
Mm-hmm.
it's just natural. It's not special. I don't think art is different than any of the labors we do all day long. I think it's natural. And so it's natural that when the world is burning down around us, sometimes we turn to a book or a film, or we dance, or we sing. And this is one of those ways to be together in a poem.
One thing that I like about it is that it speaks to the importance of our existence being acknowledged by others. And for me, it speaks to how knowing a person's name gives you a sort of power with the other person. And I've always thought that's a very interesting concept.
Sure. I mean, back to religions. In some religions, you're not supposed to speak the name of the Almighty. You can't even spell it. You have to put like a hyphen between the first and last letter. Or if you summon, or every time you say the name, you're summoning. And so if you do that without the intention of engaging, that's a waste of magic. So you don't do that, right? Mm-hmm. To call the name in vain.
Yeah.
Did not have the intention to engage. Why did you call me here? Mm-hmm. You know, fairy tales, Rumpelstiltskin, you know, things like that. Harry Potter, he who shall not be named.
Do you think death is like that? Is one of those figures that would you speak death unless you meant to summon it?
Well, not me in particular, because I'm Mexican and we are quite acquainted. We do have pet names for her, like La Flaca, or you know, like we have pet names for her. There's a cult of worship around her, and sometimes they call her La Niña, the little one. So, which is like a very common thing to diminutize things and make them pet-like. We have an entire holiday about death and its realities. So there is such a thing as, my mom says, llamando las desgracias. So do not, or what my Southern friend calls borrowing trouble from tomorrow. Like there is a kind of summoning. I think that people who are, like, well, don't manifest it, I don't think it's that simple or that direct. So I'm not afraid to call death's name in particular. And in my poems, I'm not afraid to call, because my poetry is also quite acquainted with death.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but I believe that for some people, there are channels of communication that are very strong. So they're just very careful how they invoke. Foreign from my maker, except for our hands, do you see, my love, the hand of malediction? I cursed for the first time by making a fist. We sit across from each other and compare hands, and here, this mark, that knob or gesture. We point together to make the lights come on and off, and laugh. We are witches. We sew worry into our bodies and mouths, our pretty shared hands, rung as bells. I grew long fingers unfit for rings. I made a compass's needle of my body. My thin wrists, these are for housing your sorrows. You never kissed my wrists. I want the bad word in your mouth, that word for despair. I already know it.
I think that's a powerful poem. I love it. I cursed for the first time by making a fist. I think it's difficult to write a line which feels so universally true as that. So thank you.
Thank you.
For giving that to the world. There's this relationship between the two figures in the poem. It's a little bit simpatico.
I don't know what that word means in English. Can you?
I think it's similar to the Spanish definition. Like there's a feeling of friendliness or like harmony between different people.
Because the way I know that word is when you call a person simpático, they're likable.
Mm-hmm.
But I've never heard it like two people they're well getting along. They get along well.
That's how I've understood it, but I'm a little embarrassed to say now that I didn't even look it up, and I probably should have to know what the definition is.
Used, right?
What's
you know words by how they're used, and that's, I'm sure most of the words we all use, we never looked up. We just heard it used a couple times, and we use it in that way.
Yeah. But I'm going to look that up after the interview. The speaker delights in this like shared witchiness, I would almost say. And even so, there's this tension between the speaker and the other person in the poem. Maybe it's a lover. You never kissed my wrists. I want the bad word in your mouth. Tell me about the relationship in this poem between the figures. And if you want, I would be open to hearing the word for despair that you have in mind. Or maybe it's not like a real word. Maybe it's just an action. I don't know.
Well, a word for a feeling may not even be the name of that feeling. It could be the name of a town, or it could be a month of a year, right? So like despair could be 2020, or despair could be, and as far as like characters in my book, I think one of my favorite things about my own book is that there is no plotness. Mm-hmm. So it's never about a single thing. Mm-hmm. I think it's a lot of feelings that are grouped for intensity's sake. So similarly, when there appear to be characters in a poem, it may not be the same character at the beginning of the poem than at the end of the poem, or the same way something starts about a romantic partner ends up being about a parent, or vice versa. And families a lot, So I think that in this poem, it sort of goes back and forth with the speaker trying to connect with how are we the same? Look at us, right? We have these similarities. And I think a lot of people do that. They like to sit next to each other and see how they're alike, And a lot of the ways we do that is by like the shape of your hands, or what you can do with your hands. Are you double jointed? Can you bend your thumb? What does your palmistry say? Where do you have this line? Do you have that knob in your wrist? Do you, have long fingers or short? I think people are always, that's a very simple, very childlike thing to do. Yeah. So I think that there's more than one relationship in this poem, but I think it's a very universal thing, as you said, to try to find similarities.
Thank you so much for reading these poems from your book, The Other House. I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed the book. I enjoyed speaking to you. Thank you for the privilege of being able to speak to you and joining me on Zoom under these unusual circumstances.
Thanks for having me, and I hope that this background isn't too busy.
I like it.